Have you ever stopped to think why many women, after a breakup, seem to turn into true warriors against the next man who comes along? Why does that once intense love turn into distrust, veiled accusations, and a kind of emotional militancy against any new possibility? Freud once said something few fully understand: nothing repressed can stay dead. It always comes back, disguised. When a relationship ends, what hasn't been processed, digested, or felt in its entirety doesn't disappear. This pain, this unresolved emotion, remains alive, pulsing, active within her. And it's not simply baggage from the past, something left behind and somehow resolved. No, it's an emotional bomb waiting to explode, stored within the unconscious, waiting for a target to unleash its power. If you entered her life right after the breakup, congratulations, or maybe not so much. You end up being the custodian of the emotional debts the other person left behind. You become the new culprit, even though you didn't do anything. Freud showed us that in human psychology, there's something called transference. This mechanism causes emotions, feelings, and even anger directed at someone from the past to be unconsciously transferred to someone else in the present. So when they react coldly, suspiciously, aggressively, or even distantly, it's not you they're really dealing with. It's the ghost of their ex, now wearing their face. This transference is an internal script that you don't write, but that you are forced to act out. You may be the opposite of your ex, the most patient, loving, and understanding person there is, but you will still carry the weight of their mistakes. The result? Constant hypervigilance, a kind of emotional detective. She'll test you, distrust you, and make seemingly baseless accusations. This isn't a lack of love, but rather an unconscious defense to avoid reliving the pain. But this defense doesn't protect the relationship, it destroys it. Because, let's face it, no one can stand being treated as a suspect for something they didn't do. This chronic distrust creates a barrier that prevents any solid construction. Therefore, entering someone's life right after a long relationship is like stepping on a landmine. You can walk slowly, try to diffuse the mines, but the terrain is already mined, and until she breaks this cycle, you'll always be the next culprit, the next enemy of her heart. The unconscious mind doesn't understand time. Everything is present. Freud made it clear. In the unconscious, there is no past. Everything is present. This explains why, for her, that new relationship doesn't start from scratch. It begins in her courtroom, where you're already sitting in the defendant's chair before you even open your mouth. The thing is, the judgment isn't fair. She's judging you for something that isn't yours. She's repeating an old script, reliving unresolved pain and hurt. This process, transference, is an unconscious repetition that causes old conflicts to be applied to new people. You're not arguing with them. You're arguing with the specter of your ex who carries your face. Therefore, no matter how hard you try to be understanding, to act differently, any gesture of yours that bears any resemblance to what she experienced will be interpreted as proof that history will repeat itself. This is the point where a man begins to feel like he's living in a rigged game. Her every reaction is filled with pain and memories that have nothing to do with you. You're not judged by what you did, but by what the other person did. And since her mind already has a ready verdict, any explanation or attempt at dialogue will be dismissed as more of the same. This slowly erodes. You start to walk on eggshells, measuring your words and gestures, trying to avoid conflict, but unable to escape the feeling that everything can be used against you. In the end, you realize you didn't lose to something you did, but to a narrative that began long before. Your arrival. And this is the brutal logic of transference. It doesn't see you as you are, but as it needs you to be to confirm the story it carries. Affective militancy is born from unprocessed pain. Freud taught that the mind is a battlefield of invisible battles. Unresolved traumas can transform into personal ideologies, and this includes affective ideologies. When a relationship ends painfully, this pain doesn't stay within the individual. It transforms into discourse, into a cause that must be defended at any cost. This is where affective militancy arises. It's not just carrying wounds from the past. It's raising those wounds as a banner against what the next man represents. This militancy isn't rational, it's a psychic defense. Freud described the repetition compulsion as this unconscious attempt to master trauma by reliving it, but which only reinforces it. Becoming militant against one's neighbor is to externalize unresolved anger, transforming pain into power. The problem? This militancy makes any relationship impossible. You're no longer dealing with a person, but with an aggressive and defensive narrative that doesn't accept contradiction. Your every gesture will be interpreted as an attack or betrayal. Not because you are the aggressor, but because the trauma demands constant reinforcement of your emotional protection. For the man who wants to build something real, this is a harsh sentence. As long as the trauma is turned into a cause, he will be the enemy in her emotional ring. The only way out? Recognizing that you can't fight ghosts. And that often the best move is to not enter into this war. Freud said that behind all aggression, criticism, or excessive control lies a core of deep insecurity. This is the great truth that almost no one sees. Post-relationship women often carry an internal fear of being abandoned, rejected, or simply not loved enough. This fear, however, isn't stated out loud. It's camouflaged by an armor of attitude, by constant criticism, by preemptive attacks, as if to say, if I strike first, I won't be the victim. This armor acts as a psychic shield, hiding the emotional emptiness she still carries. Freud showed that the mind creates these masks to avoid direct contact with the deepest pain. What appears to be dominant, even offensive behavior is actually a silent plea for safety and validation, an internal cry for care. The problem is that the man who tries to approach this armor finds no vulnerability, only resistance, and the more he tries to understand, the more it recedes, closing this invisible barrier. This creates a vicious cycle that Freud would call a repetition of the past, an unconscious attempt to protect oneself from still open wounds, unaware that the strength one displays is actually a fragile defense, the weight of other people's guilt. When you become a scapegoat, Freud explained that the human mind projects unresolved internal feelings onto external objects to alleviate guilt and psychological suffering. In the case of the post-relationship woman, this means that you, the new partner, end up becoming the target of the blame that belongs to the ex, and often to herself. She's not accusing you of what you did, but of mistakes the past hasn't yet integrated. Her unconscious needs to externalize this guilt to avoid internal confrontation, and you become the scapegoat for this dynamic. Freud warned us that this mechanism creates a parallel, psychic reality, where facts are distorted to protect the ego. This creates an environment where responsibility is never taken and blame is always shifted. For men, this means living with accusations that make no logical sense, but which have enough emotional force to destabilize any relationship. The practical result? You carry the weight of conflicts that aren't yours, in a relationship where emotional justice is just a mirage. Knowing this is essential to avoid drowning in other people's guilt, and to understand how far it's worth persisting. Chronic distrust, the invisible wall between two bodies. Freud said that distrust stems from deep, unhealed psychic wounds. In post-relationship women, this mechanism functions as an automatic protection. They learn to expect the worst even when there's no real reason to. This distrust is not rational. It is a distorted lens of the past on the present. For her, any neutral or even positive signal can become a threat. Freud explained that in this state, the mind creates a constant vigilance system to avoid reliving previous suffering, a true state of psychic alert. For men, this becomes an invisible wall between them. Attempts at rapprochement are constantly tested, and any mistake, real or imagined, becomes grounds for separation or conflict. The relationship becomes an arena where trust is mined territory, a space where fear builds walls. To outsiders, it may seem like an exaggeration, a lack of faith or immaturity, but Freud teaches thus that it's a clear symptom of unresolved trauma, and that there's no shortcut. True psychic work is the only way out, and it is often not on the table, leaving the man trapped in a game he did not choose to play. The vicious cycle of repetition. When history repeats itself. Freud pointed out that the unconscious operates through repetitive patterns, attempting to resolve unresolved conflicts. A woman who hasn't worked through her wounds ends up creating a cycle where the same mistakes repeat. Themselves, and you, the new partner, are inserted as a key part of this pattern. This self-sabotage isn't conscious, it's an unconscious compulsion to relive traumas in an attempt to master them. Freud called this the repetition compulsion. The problem? This attempt doesn't heal, it only reinforces suffering and mistrust. For men, this means that no matter what they do, the dynamics tend to repeat themselves. Crises, separations, conflicts that arise out of nowhere, but which are echoes of old wounds. He gets stuck in an emotional loop that drains his energy, hope, and confidence. Recognizing this pattern is essential to avoid falling into the trap of guilt or salvationism, because healing this cycle only happens if she wants it. Without real inner work, the new relationship will just be a reenactment of the past, and you'll fall victim to the old script. Freud already said that narcissism is not just vanity, it is an essential psychic structure to keep the ego functioning. Post-relationship, this narcissism takes on a defensive guise. True vulnerability hides behind a discourse of exaggerated self-assertion and often fierce criticism of the next man. This posture serves to protect the internal wound that is still bleeding, to maintain emotional control, avoiding exposure to the risk of pain again. Freud showed that this attitude, although unconscious, is an attempt to restore shaken self-esteem, but it ends up sabotaging the possibility of true connection. For man, this means that the game is not just external, it is internal as well. Behind the defense is a person fighting his own demons. The choice you have is stay stuck in the conflict or gain clarity to avoid entering this destructive dynamic. Effective militancy, the shield that becomes a prison. When a relationship ends badly, the pain doesn't just stay inside, it becomes a discourse, a cause that needs to be defended at any cost. This effective militancy arises as a shield and weapon to protect a wounded self. She not only carries the wounds of the past, but raises them as a flag against what the next man represents. This is not a rational act, it is a psychic defense. Freud taught that repetition compulsion is an unconscious attempt to master trauma, but ultimately it only reinforces the pain. Becoming a militant against one's neighbor is to externalize unresolved anger, transforming pain into power. The problem? This activism makes any relationship impossible. You are no longer dealing with a person, but with an aggressive and defensive narrative that does not accept contradiction. Your every gesture will be interpreted as an attack or betrayal, not because you are the aggressor, but because trauma demands constant reinforcement of the emotional territory. For the man who wants something real, this is a harsh sentence. As long as trauma becomes the cause, it will always be the enemy in her emotional ring. The only way out? Recognizing that you can't fight. Ghosts, and that often the best move is to not enter into this war. The unconscious court. You arrive already condemned, Freud said. In the unconscious, there is no past. Everything is present. So when you enter the life of a woman who hasn't dealt with her past, you're not starting something new. You are entering a courtroom where, before you even speak, you are already in the defendant's chair. This judgment is governed by transference. She doesn't react to you, but to the ghost of her ex, who now has your face. You can act fairly, speak calmly, but any gesture that reminds her of old pain will be interpreted as proof that history will repeat itself. It is at this point that man begins to feel like he is in a rigged game. Her every reaction carries memories and pain that have nothing to do with him. You are not being judged by what you did, but by what someone else did. And since her mind already has its verdict, any explanation from you will be dismissed as more of the same. The result? You walk on eggshells, measuring every word, knowing everything can be used against you. In the end, you realize you didn't lose to your actions. You lost to a narrative that began long before you arrived. This is the brutal logic of transference. It doesn't see you as you are, but as it needs you to be to confirm the story it carries. The solution that few see, understanding so as not to be a victim, if you want to stop being the target of her emotional ghosts, it's time to open your eyes to what Freud made clear. Without real inner work, the past will always dictate the present. Don't accept being a pawn in an unconscious game. Know the real structure behind unbalanced relationships. Take control of your emotional destiny. Understanding that love is not just a symptom but a cause is the first step to mastering this dynamic. And to do that, you need to look the truth in the face, without illusions. Subscribe, activate the bell, and get ready to dive deep into this reality. Here we don't just want to tell stories, we want you to break out of this cycle. May you master your story. May you stop being the next culprit. May you learn to choose what you deserve and not carry what is not yours.